I think, one of the things of growing up, and by that I mean reaching the age of 70, which I've reached, is understanding one's own country more clearly. It takes decades. When you live within a milieu, it's actually not easy to understand the immediate milieu you're living within. It may be easier to understand a rural African village or a highland economy in the Altiplano in the Andes in Bolivia than it is to understand your own society. And I did not understand American foreign policy for much of my career in depth. I had skepticism early on because even as a 14-year-old, I was marching against the Vietnam War. And I grew up in the era of the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King. And in the Watergate era. So I don't want to say I was, naive and Pollyannish, but the extent to which the U.S. relentlessly, as a government, resorted to assassinations, coups, and wars of choice is something that I only came to understand step by step. You'd learn about
Yeah.
Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. It's a learning experience. It's not something I was taught in class, that's for sure. Or Lumumba's assassination, largely at the hands of the CIA in cahoots with the Belgians in 1961. And then you find out step by step by step that there are dozens and dozens of these cases. And then you come to learn, or I came to learn at least only over time, how deeply systemic it is and how it became completely embedded in American foreign policy institutionally through, I'd say, most notably the 1947 National Security Act, which established the CIA as a secretive army of the President of the United States that could do almost anything beyond the law without accountability. And
That's
this is, to my mind, the reality of U.S. foreign policy. And when you think about the ability of presidents to bring us into wars, to overthrow governments, to assassinate foreign politicians,
mhm.
it is a tyrannical state. It's not a democratic state. I've, of course, over the years came to know many members of Congress. They don't do their job because institutionally they're suborned, they're bribed not to, they're extricated if they try to do their job. There's been only one real congressional oversight of the CIA, and that was 50 years ago this year, the Church Committee. For 50 years, there has not been accountability of the Central Intelligence Agency. So,
Mhm.
does the US government try to overthrow other governments nonstop? Has it aimed to basically uh, divide up Russia after 1991 in the same way that it tried to end the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1991? Absolutely, yes. And it's spelled out in many places, but you have to look for them and you have to know where to look. And when you do look, it's not a happy story.
Yeah. Do you tune in at all to Michael Benz?
No, I mean, I know who he is, but I
Yeah.
don't, unfortunately, given time constraints, I don't,
Mhm.
unfortunately, have the chance to tune into too many other, too
He
many.
he he's awesome on knowing so much of the institutional play-by-play, blow-by-blow detail.
Uh-huh.
I really find him worthwhile and I recommend him. He calls it the Department of Dirty Tricks, like the
Yeah.
CIA. And
One
then,
one thing that I think is for me, I work with governments all over the world, Of course, I work on economics. I don't work on intelligence or security issues. But I have the chance to speak with people all over the world all the time. Much of what is called secretive or covert, of course, is completely known. It's just denied. What we mean by a
Yeah.
covert operation is that it's a denied operation, not that it's hidden from view. The coup is there in broad daylight. Sometimes it couldn't be more obvious. It's just that the US government says, me? I didn't do it. And so, in this sense, you definitely hear a lot.
And the New York Times says it the same way.
The New York Times is useless, unfortunately, except
Mhm.
if you want to know what theater to go to or what play to see. Other than that, useless in terms of trying to
And
understand foreign policy.
a big point that I learned from Ben's and that he drives home and illustrates really nicely is that the dirty tricks playbook has been turned on inward, has been turned on us with the censorship, persecution, the whole 9 yards, propaganda, intimidation, and so on, lawfare. Well, I guess lawfare is an aspect of it. And and I just wonder if that's like how you feel about it, that the moral attitude, the moral regard for people outside the country has been very terrible and disgraceful, and that kind of almost moral rot is now like very much infecting our domestic politics. Does that make sense?
I think there's no question that, to use a maybe a cliched analogy, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and the American Republic became the American Empire. And I think that this is true. And imperial power does not look so well
Yeah.
on internal threats as well. And I'm of the school that JFK and RFK and MLK were taken out by forces that included parts of the U.S. Government. I
Mhm.
don't think that this is. I've spent decades now, like probably many of my generation, to try to understand those events. And I think what is absolutely undeniable is that the forensics are contrary to the official story. And second, that there was never a serious investigation of these assassinations. And that tells you a lot, to my mind. And aside from motive and opportunity, just the sheer behavior of senior reaches of the US government, the fact that CIA documents regarding the Kennedy assassination are still not released 62 years later, despite repeated calls by Congress for their release. And Biden, again, in the long list of presidents, kept secret documents from decades ago. It tells you something.
Um, Another question for you. Is there anything to the idea, my idea, that the more you realized this about, if you will, the deep state, foreign policy, and the influence of sort of those considerations on economics, generally speaking, like does this perhaps in some way explain, because I see kind of a shift in your career from a focus on poverty to a focus on peace. Does that make any sense? I'm just kind of conjecturing.
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, if your goal is to uh, improve the world, if it sounds, I hope that's not too highfalutin, but that is my goal, to do what I can in my
Sure.
way during my career. And so as I've said, I view economics as a problem-solving field and a normative field to try to help make things better. Well, the truth is war is a terrible inefficiency. Let me just say, it's just extraordinarily frustrating to try to be building something and to have trillions of dollars invested in destroying it. And so it's not only maddening, it's to my mind, verging on a kind of insanity. Second, the nature of our war is terrifying in my view, in that we are closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any time during the entire nuclear age. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're in a kind of prolonged Cuban Missile Crisis right now. We're actually firing missiles, US personnel at Russia. Can this possibly be right? The answer is no. We're actually talking openly about war with China by 2027. And there are a lot of people in Washington who are proudly talking about that. And we have official documents that we must prepare for war with China by 2027 and so forth. And all of this in nearly the complete absence of diplomacy, of trying to solve the problems, trying to understand why would that be? How could we avoid this? Are we really on a sane course? So this is, for me, simply one of the reasons why this became a priority for me. When you do reach the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, this is not a small matter. And it's one worthy of attention. But then I realized another thing, which is I've been there to these places. I was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. I was an advisor to Boris Yeltsin. I was an advisor to Leonid Kuchma, the second president of Ukraine. I've seen the Maidan. I've seen the post-coup government. I've met these people. I know them. And so that also changes the stakes for me. I've seen it with my own eyes, this misbehavior. I've had presidents say to me, they're gonna take me out, and then the CIA literally marched them out. I'm talking about President Aristide of Haiti, who said to me, they're going to take me out, Jeff. And I laughed and, no, Mr. President, we're going to solve this, and so on. But not only could I not help when they froze the IMF lending, when they froze the World Bank lending, part of the normal playbook to bring down a poor government, but then they marched the president of Haiti out to an unmarked plane and flew him, I think it was 23 hours, to the Central African Republic, and then denied that the US launched a coup. And the New York Times, by the way, wouldn't even cover it. I called the reporter whom I knew in Port-au-Prince. I said, well, are you going to cover it? She said to me, and I'm quoting, my editor is not interested. So when you see these things before your own eyes, it's not reading them in the history books. It's not making a surmise. It makes you sick, frankly. And it also raises the stakes. And that's why I've gotten more and more involved on these geopolitical issues. It's also, I might say, if you're working on issues like environmental protection or poverty reduction, it's just damn annoying that we're spending trillions of dollars on destroying things and killing people and not focusing on these other problems. And so this is also in my way saying, could we clear away the underbrush so that we could get onto things that really can improve the lives of people?
Getting back to Russia, I believe you feel that much, if not most, of what is said in the major media in the West is false about Russia.
It's laughable. If it's tragic also. It's just pure propaganda. And the words come down from on high. The word of choice after 2022 was unprovoked. It's not such a common word, but the New York Times used the word unprovoked, by my count, 26 times in the first year of the special military operation that commenced on February 24th, 2022. It's not an accident that that word was used repeatedly. It was the word of choice. Of course, it wasn't provoked. The one thing that the paper might have done was run one story to say, well, what are the antecedents of what happened on February 24th, 2022? Why did Putin decide that Russia would have this military operation? What had Putin put on the table with the US on December 15th, 2021? What had happened with previous agreements like the Minsk II agreement? What about that coup on February 22nd, 2014 that brought down Viktor Yanukovych? Well, my experience with the New York Times is they would not run one analytical story or one op-ed that would even raise these questions, much less present the evidence. And so this is, to my mind, simply journalistic dishonesty.
And they blame Russia for so many things. It's like the go-to blame for like something that's wrong, and sometimes even, our own U.S. officials' deeds.
Well, there's a tip.
Russia,
There's
Russia, Russia.
also, yes, we know it from social psychology. We actually have theories of it from evolutionary biology called two-level selection, that we're very good at loving ourselves and very good at hating the other. And so we choose the evidence accordingly. We filter the evidence. We have confirmation bias. We have every kind of behavioral economics bias in a particular direction. And we have pervasive and nonstop media bias. Last week, there was an article after the tragic, probably accidental shooting down of the Azerbaijan airplane, which had flown into a conflict zone in Russia, where Ukraine was attacking with drones and Russia was counterattacking with anti-drone missiles, and quite possibly, though we don't know to this moment, the civilian aircraft was shot down by Russian anti-drone missile or by the shrapnel from some related explosion. Anyway, the Washington Post columnist wrote, well, this is basically what uncivilized countries do. And it's just Russia's uncivilized. They're the barbarians. We're the civilized country. Of course, the whole concept of who's civilized and who's barbarian goes back about 3,000 years. It's a trivial point that one side is always the civilized side and the other side's always the barbarian, uncivilized side. But do we have to read this baloney in our press from grown-ups who are writing these columns? I generally don't, but once in a while I do, and then I remember why I generally don't.
Why are Western elites, governmental elites, like so bent on breaking up Russia?
Well, first of all, I think it has been our strategy since 1945. As soon as World War II ended, the whole U.S. security system, even before there was a CIA, when there was just an OSS, and when there was still the operational committees of the U.S. military, said we're going to have a war with Russia or Soviet Union shortly. By 1952 was the estimate then. We already from that moment, even before that, had refused to share information about the atomic weapons development and so forth with the Russians. The idea was the Bolsheviks were our enemy and we're going to take them on next. And the CIA was basically created with that long-standing mission to keep out leftist governments, to overthrow leftist governments, and to topple the Soviet Union. What's interesting is that when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, the mission continued. It was just redefined as now we have to dismember or decolonize or otherwise weaken Russia in the same way as the Soviet Union. We're almost there. And the game plan became surround Russia with NATO, weaken Russia around the margins, double down on our strategy that dates back to Zbig Brzezinski in 1979 on funding jihadists to weaken Russia's periphery, because that's the Islamic periphery around Russia, and funding jihadists to fight the Russian Orthodox Russians was a long-standing CIA operation. We started it up in Chechnya, in the Balkans again, and so forth. And so this never ended. This is where I came in individually into the story.
But why? But the question is why? It's like Russia, in some sense, said, Gorbachev was kind of like, yeah, I guess you guys are right. And the West couldn't take yes for an answer. But
Oh,
why?
there's such a wonderful line of Henry Kissinger. I'm going to read it because I pulled it up on my screen to quote it. In a 1994 interview, actually December 5, 1994, on PBS with Robert McNeil. McNeil asked, "Why are we expanding NATO? For heaven's sake?" And Kissinger and McNeil says, "My understanding is there are no borders that are threatened at the moment. Even the existing borders of NATO are not threatened at the moment. Why are we expanding NATO?" he's asking. And Kissinger says, "The existing borders of NATO can't be threatened because they are now adjoining friendly countries. So there's nobody there with any capacity to threaten the borders, at least not from the East. So the problem is whether the new states of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet satellites, should be included into NATO." And then Kissinger says, "If we are reluctant to antagonize the Russians today, when they're weak, it's an illusion to think that somewhere 3-4 years down the road, we can suddenly move in that direction." It's, it's mind-boggling to me. It's almost hilarious.
Yeah.
What's he saying? He's saying, of course we should antagonize them. Either we do it when they're weak or we should do it when they're strong, but he takes it for granted. There's no threat, but
Oh,
we should
it's amazing.
antagonize them.
It's amazing, but we're like repeating the thing to be explained. So is it like what underlies this, you know?
The idea that I think traditionally there are three claims for state motivation. One claim is fear. So you act in a way because you feel threatened. Well, Kissinger explains, no, we're not doing exactly that. This isn't fear. The second is glory in one form or another. Alexander the Great really did want to conquer the entire world. He thought he was the son of Zeus. He was told that by the soothsayer in Egypt, and he went out to prove it to the world. And the United States doesn't put it exactly that way, but it puts it that we have a mission in the world, the same mission civilisatrice of the French Empire or the civilizing mission of the British Empire. We are America. We are the liberal leaders of the free world. We will make the world safe in our image. And people, grown-ups, again, although not in a grown-up way, in my view, take this stuff seriously, like Robert Kagan, liberal hegemony. We just should run the world. That's the best way for the world. And then the third is, is the grubbier motives attached to this. Lindsey Graham, who I regard as the stupidest senator in the U.S. Senate, and he comes along and confirms my thoughts with high frequency, says, well, we've got to fight in Ukraine. They have $10 trillion of minerals. This is, we got to control them so the Russians and the Chinese don't control them. So the fight over resources plays a role, or the perception of that fight. There are two kinds of resources at stake. One is the direct war as business resources. The military industrial complex, after all, is a $1.5 trillion a year operation.
And
It's,
I'm sure a lot of it goes in all sorts of directions.
by the way, it goes to fund the think tanks all along the East Coast. This is
Yeah,
every think tank, my own university, the think tanks in Washington, they're funded by these companies. They're funded by the US government. This is a
yeah,
national effort, after all. So I think the warmongering, the military industrial complex, the crude perception that those resources are ours to be taken,
yeah,
the glory of running the world, the purported or claimed threats, although Kissinger made clear there are no threats. We should just antagonize them when they're weak, so we don't have to do it when they're strong. These are all motives. There's no single motive
yeah,
for this, except to say that war is a state activity, and
yeah,
running a complex state is a coalition of forces. It's not one person. It's not huge, but it's military contractors, it's politicians,
yeah.
it is ideologues, it's private companies doing business alongside. Um,
Yeah.
it is a coalition. And
So,
the
yeah,
structurally, the permanence and unaccountability of the CIA, in my mind, is the single biggest structural liability of the US
mm,
system, because we created an institution literally outside of legal control, and did so knowingly and deliberately, and to the regret of, famously, of Harry Truman himself, who signed the National Security Act, to the fear of Dwight D. Eisenhower, uh, who warned us of the military industrial complex, and in my view, to the demise of JFK and RFK, who I think perished for their opposition to this secretive, unaccountable state within a state.
one last question. So I really can't imagine having a conversation along these lines with any other. I don't know any other economist, much less a very prominent and effective and influential one. I mean, millions and millions of watch you, I bet you, every week. If maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but not too much. Um, so how come if you're right, and I, as you can see, I'm inclined to agree. Like, why is it so difficult? There's two questions here. Why are, like, I still want to kind of know, like, how, why, if no one else does what you're doing, I don't know if the thing to be explained is why no one else does it or why you're the one who does.
You
But there's
know,
that question about, like,
yeah,
why are you different? And then kind of the bigger question of, it does seem so in your face, actually, so much of this, and the whole way they're raping democracy, like in Romania recently. Um, it's just so in your face, and it's like, why is there such a strong taboo? And like, will there be like an awakening of some sort about all this?
it's a funny thing. It is in our faces to a shocking extent. Uh, you have Nord Stream blown up, for example, after President Biden says, if Russia invades, we will end it. And the reporter says, well, how? And he smirks, Biden smirks and says, well, we have our ways. And then it happens. And then everyone says, duh, it was the Russians. It was the Russians. And you watch all of these columnists and talking heads on television propounding idiocy. Another example, COVID. I chaired a major commission with serious people for the Lancet uh, medical journal. And I wouldn't say I'm a public health expert, but as an economist, I've devoted a considerable amount of my time to understanding public health issues, and I led a major commission for WHO. I created the idea of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. I've been around this issue. I got into the COVID issue. It's crystal clear the US government has lied and lied and lied about the origin of the virus. We don't know every bit of the story. We know that there's a cover up. That's what we know. Well, duh, it's natural, we're told. Come on. Can people behave even minimally honestly and rationally? Well, now, the public believes little that the government says. This is what's very interesting for me. When the government says Lee Harvey Oswald is the sole assassin of JFK, despite all the forensics, and Sirhan is the sole assassin of RFK, despite the fact that the coroner himself in the postmortem said it couldn't have been because the shot was fired from behind, not in front. The public doesn't believe any of this. It's just that the government doesn't have to say anything more. It just says that's the answer, pure and simple. We don't actually give a whether you believe it or not. Okay, this is our context on many different issues. They don't care that they're blowing smoke in our face. And we know it, but they don't care. Well, I don't know. Call me old-fashioned, but I sat through a lot of seminars in my youth where the idea was to poke holes in the mistakes of the paper presenter. That's how I was trained, that you challenge the claims and you try to look at them. And when the claims that are being made are not only on their face false, but extraordinarily dangerous because they're leading us closer and closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation, it's worth calling them out.
Yeah. Well, you're poking holes in very big narratives. I'm very grateful for what you're doing, and thank you for talking today.
Great to be with you. I appreciate it. And again, Happy New Year.